I'm very pleased to introduce Aurora Pfaff tonight. She'll be presenting High-Flying Adventures in Aviation History in the High Peaks. And it's based on her 2024 book, which she has out there, Aviation in the Adirondacks. Just a little bit about Aurora. She is I presume, the content manager with the Rural Office of Sustainable Tourism. That's her day job. She works for Roost. She's a freelance writer based in Saranac Lake. And in addition to the book that she is talking about tonight, she's been published in Adirondack Life, Majesty, which I believe is the Royal Majesty, and yes, okay, Local Adirondack, New York Archives, and Beyond Words Literary Magazine. And she may have other things she wants to share with you about her background. So we're very happy to have Aurora here tonight, and I'd ask you to please welcome her and give her a hearty welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to everyone for coming. Just a quick couple of housekeeping items. I was born loud. Pepe upstairs is keeping a really close eye on the volume of the microphone. If I accidentally start shouting at you, please don't take it personally. I'm just really excited about planes. The other thing about the raffle tickets, it is cheaper to buy the raffle ticket than it is cheaper to buy my book. I am not trying to get out of any sales, but if you want to spend a couple of dollars, you could win a book and wine and chocolate. So it's always a nice combination. So thank you. What I thought we would do is I'll just give you a quick highlight of what we're going to do this evening. I'm going to talk first about the very first flight in the Adirondacks. Then we'll talk a bit about Lake Placid specific and the Keene area a little bit. And then after I'm done talking, I will have plenty of time for questions. And I always like to encourage people if they have stories that they want to share. I've already heard a couple this evening, which is so fun. My favorite part of doing any of these presentations are hearing stories from people who took their first flying lesson on a small plane in a tiny airfield in Wilmington or down at Marcy Field, which has an amazing history on its own. So definitely the lovely Karen has shared an interesting story with me. She even brought a photograph from her family collection. So if you have anything to share, I would love to hear it. I'm sure other people would. So let's get started. The story of the first flight in the Adirondacks is about this man on the right with the rather charming cap on. His name is George Gray, and he made the very first successful flight in the Adirondacks. And I hope you will forgive me for sharing this. It kind of happened in Franklin County. So I hope I'm sorry. It's a really fun story. It's a really fun story, and it set the stage for so much adventure and excitement and interesting history and interesting people that I just have to tell the story of this man. George Gray was born in September of 1878. He grew up in Blue Hill, Maine, which is way, way up on the coast near Acadia. And at the age of 33, he was certified as a pilot. And he attended the Wright Flying School in Ohio, Wright being the Wright brothers, one of the Wright brothers actually being his instructor and signed his certification. Back then there was no FAA, there were no official licenses. You just got a certificate from your flying school that said, yep, you're good to go. And so he learned from the very best. And he almost immediately, as soon as he got his certification, he leased the plane that you see in this image, and he paid for it. It was a shocking sum of money. It was $500. And he paid for it by barnstorming, by traveling, by giving flying demonstrations all around the East Coast, and made a pretty decent living at it, and got to go to a lot of different places. The man, incidentally, to the left with the camera and also wearing a very trendy cap, his name is William Colliker. He, if you are at all familiar or interested in Saranac Lake history, he took a lot of photos. He's very well known in the area nowadays for his photography shop. He took a lot of photos, and he developed other people's photos, and he sold prints. And so it's because of Colliker that we have photos of this actual event, this multi-day first visit by a plane to the Adirondacks. And so we're really very fortunate. When I started doing this research, I didn't know what was out there for photos. And so amazing. Imagine my delight when not only are there photos, but they're really good quality photos. And this gives you a good sense of what the plane was like. So Gray arrived in Vermontville on October 4th, 1912. He was intended to land in Saranac Lake. That was the goal. But Whiteface Mountain had other ideas. The weather was bad. The weather was very bad. And the light was fading. It was October. It was cold. Mind you, this is an open air aircraft. There's no heating. There are no blankets. There are no mints. This is a very, what we would call bare bones experience. And the plane only had so much fuel. This plane had about 100-mile range that it could go. Interestingly enough, with a 45 horsepower engine, or 35, 45 horsepower engine. I don't know much about engines. Other people do. 45 is not a lot. A car going at the same time could go just as fast, which we'll learn more about soon, actually. So Gray's flying. He's on his way to Saranac Lake. He doesn't actually quite know how much fuel he has left. The weather's bad. It's getting dark. It's cold. And so he puts down in a farmer's field in Vermontville. And imagine you are a farmer and someone knocks on your door, and it's a man who says, "I just landed in your field. Could I use your telephone?" And that's exactly what happened. He called into town to say to the people who were expecting him that he had arrived. And this photo was taken, you'll see in the corner, by William Colliker in the days following his unexpected, rather stunning arrival. And it's another great photo because it really captures part of this story. It captures something terrifying, exciting. It captures so many things about this unique event that had not happened in this area before. No one had flown in the Adirondacks. And here comes this young man in his jaunty cap and his aircraft, which is made of metal, little wood, canvas. The wings are made out of canvas mostly. And so Colliker was able to get great photos of this event that we can enjoy now. Once Gray arrived, he would stay in Saranac Lake for several days, giving flying demonstrations. And they were rather hair-raising demonstrations, frankly. They included nosedives. Bear in mind, in this plane, not just any plane, but this plane, sharp banking turns, a trick called the dangerous spiral, which was some sort of spiral event, a spiraling stall, actually, that he would pull out of. I find stalls terrifying as it is, much less in that aircraft. And something called the Devil's Dip, which I still haven't figured out what the Devil's Dip was. It sounds scary. I'm sure it was scary. I'm not even sure I want to know what that was. And this is how he spent a few days in Saranac Lake, much to the delight of the locals. I love this photo. I love the dog and the hat. As soon as he arrived, Gray was deluged with visitors, which was partially the point. This was not a flight that happened just by chance. He had been contracted by a gentleman with the very interesting name of Caribou Bill Cooper, Caribou being his nickname. Caribou Bill is kind of a interesting legend in the Adirondacks, not as famous as someone like Noah Rondo, who we will meet later. He was a dog sled driver. He delivered mail in Alaska. He set up a silent film studio on Upper Saranac Lake, and he was a really clever entrepreneur, very, very clever entrepreneur. He answered an ad that George Gray had placed in a newspaper, and he arranged for George Gray to arrive in Saranac Lake, that he was going to do all these demonstrations. They were going to sell tickets. The plane eventually had to be put into a tent for a few reasons. One reason being that the plane needed to be guarded. There was a tendency at this time, because people were so excited to see an aircraft that they had never seen one before in their lives, people would snip little bits of it off to take home as a souvenir, which is really bad. This is bad. You don't do that. And so the plane had to be guarded, so it was in a tent. Well, that also meant that then they could charge admission to the tent. So if you wanted to see the plane, you had to pay a few cents to get in, and pay a few cents to then go to a flying demonstration, and pay a few cents to meet the pilot. And all of this was arranged by Caribou Bill, who I suspect is the owner of the dog wearing a hat. And I think that's a pipe in the dog's mouth as well. I love that dog very much. I wanted to put the dog on the cover of the book, but that was a no. And so some of these gentlemen are locals who went to see George Gray, to meet this intrepid pilot who landed on a field in Vermontville in October. He did eventually make his way to Saranac Lake the next day, after sort of getting himself together. And one of the visitors, he had a lot of visitors, one of them was Paul Smith. And Paul Smith said, "I would love for you to take me up as a passenger." And George Gray said no. And a lot of people asked, could you take me up? And George Gray said no. And then a young woman asked, she was from Virginia, and she was visiting a friend who had tuberculosis. And she very politely asked if she could take a flight, and this was something she'd been wanting to do in the very short years since the Wright brothers took their first flight. At this point, it had been less than 10 years since the Wright brothers' first flight, and we had a young man landing in the Saranac Lake area, in the Lake Placid area. So George Gray said, "No, I'm not going to take you up. It's too dangerous." She said, "Well, I can give you $50. And he said, "Well, no, it has to be $100. It's much too unsafe. It's very dangerous, especially for a woman." And she said to him, "Well, how is the safety related to the increased price? Why charge me more to make it safer, which you can't do?" And he said, "Okay, you've got a point there." And he liked her chutzpah, shall we say. And so he finally said yes. She was on horseback, by the way. This was a time when we've got a man in a plane, we also have people with automobiles, and we have people with horse and buggy and riding solo horses. So he said, "Meet me back at the field where I first landed, and I will take you for a ride." So she rides her horse. She was staying quite close to Fletcher's Field. And he flies over, and he goes to pick her up, and she had on riding clothes, she wasn't wearing a fur coat or anything like that. They strapped her to the seat with luggage straps because that was the best way they could think of to keep her truly safe in this aircraft and not fall off the aircraft. And they took a flight, very short, few miles from Vermontville into Saranac Lake, landed, much to the excitement of a variety of people who were waiting, and rumor had spread about this. And Caribou Bill decided he's going to start charging people more money to meet the lady who has been on the plane. And George Gray was a little bit miffed about that and said, "No, absolutely not." Meanwhile, this young woman, whose name is Edith, but her nickname was Jack. Jack is still strapped into the plane, by the way, while all this is going on. They roll the plane into the tent and released her from there, and she was freezing cold because it was October, because they were a few thousand feet up. Not too many thousand feet up, certainly not anything like we do today. Like my new friends skydive from 30,000 feet, and that frankly is terrifying. This was just a few thousand feet up, but she was freezing cold. And she gave the check to George Gray for her $50, and he didn't cash it. And instead, they fell in love and they got married. I know, it's a good story, right? Yeah. It's such a good story. She eventually wrote a book about their time together because before they had children, they flew together. She was very much a part of his flying career for several years. They named their plane Up because that was the direction it was meant to go. They had a few close calls, one involving a fence and a train, but they survived. They did a good job. And one of the fantastic things about this photo, to bring it all back, is that you get a really good sense of the plane itself. And like I've used the phrase bare bones because it's really accurate, I think. I think we get used to, we're spoiled by aircraft these days. We're spoiled by flying. We're used to it. It's nothing new and fancy and novel anymore. We go to the airport, we get on a plane, we fly across the globe. This is it. It's a contraption, essentially. And it worked. But you had to be a little bit brave and a bit clever and a bit ingenious to take something like this on. And so thank heavens yet again, for William Colliker and his photo. The plane had no safety belts, hence the luggage straps for poor Jack. Everything was open to the air, and it was actually very difficult to steer. You can see in this image, that is what he's using to steer. Those levers that he has his hands on, that's how he's flying the plane. And they're hard to maneuver. It was not an easy thing to do. To get a sense of the wind, he would have to tie a handkerchief to the plane. I love this photo too. And perhaps the very best part of George Gray's adventure in Saranac Lake, flying over the Adirondacks, flying over stunning, gorgeous Whiteface, which it's funny to think about. I mean, I'm so used to the profile of Whiteface with the castle and being able to see the toll road, and this was a time when there was no castle on the top of Whiteface and how different things must have looked. But one of the things that I think is really the most exciting about all this is that Caribou Bill, that intrepid entrepreneur, he arranged for Gray to race an automobile. Back in the day, there was a racetrack in Saranac Lake. Right now, it's the location where the Bosse's building is. There was a racetrack, and so yet again, here's Caribou Bill selling tickets. And you can see on the infield, there are other automobiles, there are horses and buggies, for all these people who came to see this amazing sight. So I did mention earlier that the horsepower of the plane was not very significant. A Chevy of the same period would have had about the same horsepower. So it was, in theory, an even match. Nowadays, we would think, oh, well, of course, the plane won. The plane, has to win. We're used to F-16s and fighter jets and little zippy Gulfstreams that take off from our local airports and can fly all over the place. But actually, in this high-flying adventure, where you can see our friend George Gray up in the tippity top in his aircraft, you can see his silhouette, and you can see this really terrific image of the driver of the car, sort of leaning to see what he's doing and driving. The car won. And the problem was the corners of the track. A car like this does not corner particularly well to begin with, but it corners better than an aircraft, which the corners were just too tight for George Gray. So he actually lost the race, much to everyone's excitement. I don't know if there was betting going on. I suspect there could have been. And so this flight, this adventure, these few days in October 1912, really started a period of time when aviation would bloom in the Adirondacks. And it changed the way people traveled, and it changed the areas of the Adirondacks that people were able to access. I know there's at least one forest ranger in this room, and certainly he would know that the Adirondacks, the wilderness was opened up by aviation. Really, since this flight happened, float planes became a reality. The wilderness was opened up to people who could not access it otherwise. And so I think it's a nice way to start, to think about this one flight and how it changed everything for so many people, including right here in Lake Placid, in the village, and in the town of North Elba, and even in the county of Essex. We're going to leave Franklin County behind. We'll just pretend that we didn't go there at all. I love this photo too. So this early, very early, sepia-toned aerial photograph is a really nice, tranquil view, I would say. We've got Mirror Lake in the foreground, Lake Placid, obviously, dominating things, beautiful, beautiful white face without the castle. And in between the lakes is actually the location of Stephen's House, which we will visit later on, which was a notable hotel in Lake Placid history, and one of the places that really established Lake Placid as a vacation destination. But more importantly, the reason I show this photo is it's a cool photo. But I think we take views like this for granted. We can go on scenic flights right here in Lake Placid. We can fly drones. It's all very normal. We're used to it. But there was a time when this wasn't the norm, when suddenly people were seeing the places they lived and loved and even simply read about in a whole new way that was made possible because of aviation. And that added to the adventure and the excitement that everyone felt. And it wasn't just pilots who were impacted by that. It was everyday people who were on the ground experiencing this. It's not certain, but it is highly likely that this photo was taken by a gentleman named Dwight Church. And he made a business out of aerial photo postcards. He had a special camera that he adapted so that the bellows stayed open while he was flying the plane. He did not have an assistant, so he's flying a plane and he's taking photos. And he made really beautiful photo postcards, which I have a few of in my collection. You probably have seen them without even realizing it. And he also sold photos of farms to the farmers who owned them. And he'd say to them, "How would you like to see your farm the way God sees it?" Because it was such a different way of viewing this world that we love and that we know. I promised you high adventure and high-flying excitement and all kinds of wonderfulness. Probably one of the most famous people to ever see Lake Placid from the air is this man. This is Charles Lindbergh in 1939, right here in Lake Placid. That's him actually at what is now Lake Placid Airport. Lindbergh had been living in Europe for several years before this photo was taken. His son had famously, unfortunately, been kidnapped and later found murdered. And his family, including his wife and his surviving children, left America and went to live in Europe for a number of years. But with World War II on the horizon, Lindbergh, who was astonishingly famous and well adored by the American public, was persuaded to return to the US and to lend a hand, essentially, with the war effort. And so although Lake Placid had had an airfield as early as the 1920s, the airport wasn't official, shall we say, until January of 1939. Later that year, Lindbergh landed in Lake Placid in this plane, which is, if you're curious, a Curtiss P-36 fighter. And he was here on behalf of the US Army Air Corps. Excuse me. His duties were multiple. He had multiple duties. Part of it was recruitment. It was exciting to see Charles Lindbergh. It was exciting for Charles Lindbergh, this famous aviator who had done this brave, wonderful thing crossing the Atlantic, to show up in small towns and recruit for the Army Air Corps and convince people to do their part for the war effort. He also was exploring potential sites for future air bases, and that was an important part. Just think, if Charles Lindbergh had maybe thought differently, there could have been an air base in Lake Placid. This was one of many places he visited, but he also spent time at the Lake Placid, or at the Au Sable Club, I'm sorry. He may have gone to the Lake Placid Club, I don't know. But he did go for sure to the Au Sable Club, and he flew his plane there as well. And it's really impressive to realize that his flight, which he started in Long Island, took 1 hour and 15 minutes. And I think that's about what you can actually go, you can go to Boston from Lake Clear in about an hour nowadays. And this is the only photo that I've been able to find of Lindbergh in Lake Placid. But it was exciting. It made the news. You know, one of the things about research that I really enjoy, and I've mentioned the stories behind all these photos, and I'm going to keep mentioning it because they're so important to me, and I think so exciting to share also, is you get to learn fun things, and you get to dig around, and you get to find out these things. You go into a project and you think, well, I don't know anything about aviation in the Adirondacks, but I'm going to find out. And maybe you think, oh, well, you know, who's the first woman to get her pilot's license in the Adirondacks? I still don't have the answer to that question. I learned about Charles Lindbergh flying to Lake Placid. I got to see this one photo. I got to read old newspaper accounts from the Lake Placid News and from the New York Times and learn some of the really interesting details of the time he spent here and what he was doing and why he came. Nowadays, if you say the phrase flying circus, 99.9% of people probably are going to think of Monty Python. If I say flying circus, are you all thinking Monty Python? Probably. My friend John's in the back nodding. But in the 20s and 30s, flying circuses were a very different thing, and they were a really exciting, thrilling form of entertainment. And more than one of them came to Lake Placid. Over the 4th of July weekend of 1930, Lake Placid was the site of a multi-day flying circus. Held over 3 days, as you see in this clipping from the Lake Placid News, again. The event included some really exciting, scary, terrifying entertainment, shall we say, formation stunt flying, demonstrations of the latest and most modern aircraft, a steeplechase to Whiteface Mountain and back. The first person to fly, take off, get to Whiteface, loop around, come back and land was the winner, which without radar I think sounds a little dangerous, but I digress. And wing walking by a gentleman named Billy Bomar. Billy Bomar is in this photo here, which is in the book. He's here in this photo with another wing walker. Her name is Ova Kinney, and this photo was not taken in Lake Placid. I could not find a photo of the flying circus that came to Lake Placid in 1930. But it is Billy Bomar and his partner, and exactly the sort of thing that they would be doing here in Lake Placid. Flying circuses were also a place where spectators could take short, inexpensive flights. During this time period, a lot of people had their very first flight thanks to a flying circus, or even thanks to a barnstormer like George Gray, if he was taking passengers that he didn't go on to marry. And in many cases, people who got to take these first flights because of a flying circus or because of a traveling pilot, they themselves went on to become pilots. And in this very area, there was a time when just about any flat field or strip of land could suffice as an airfield, and there were numerous such places in the Lake Placid area and the Adirondacks where people could land or keep a plane. And that was becoming the norm. That was the thing. People had their own planes and they would take off, and you didn't have to worry about regulations to a certain extent. That came later. But there was really a sense of excitement that somebody might have a plane that they fly on in the evenings or on the weekends. Out on the table, there are a few historic images that I had printed that you might find interesting to look at, and one of them is an envelope from it's an image of the envelope from the first airmail flight to leave the Adirondacks, which left from Marcy Field. And the pilot of that flight was a doctor. He was a local doctor. His primary concern was taking care of his patients He did not make a lot of money. He was the sort of doctor, you might have heard of him, his name is Dr. Alphonse Goff. He was the sort of guy who would not accept payment from a poor patient. His intention was to get you well. He also had a really great fondness for going really fast. So he had a Jeep that he drove very, very quickly, and he had a plane. And he was the one who took that first sack of mail from Keene Valley down to Albany and from points onward. Another person who got their start in a really simple way with aviation in the Adirondacks is Clarence Petty. And a lot of us now know him as a very formidable figure in the conservation movement. As a boy, he saw a plane land and take off on Lake Flower. And there was that magical moment that he was enraptured. And that's what the flying circuses did for a lot of people. It was entertaining, it was inexpensive, you could take a flight for a few cents. But it really captured, I think, the magic of aviation for a lot of people. The gentleman on the left, the far left, with the sort of Santa Claus-ish beard, that is Noah John Rondo, the famous Adirondack hermit, mayor of Cold River, population 1. And he's quite an Adirondack legend. A lot of people have heard of him. Even if you don't know necessarily much about Adirondack history, you've probably heard of Noah Rondo. And one of the fun things about Noah is that he took a helicopter ride in 1947. Noah was starting to, he wasn't as hermit-ish or standoffish as people might think. And in 1947, he was invited to go to the National Sportsman's Show in New York City. And he agreed, and he was picked up in North River by this helicopter. And he was taken to New York City to appear at this sportsman's show. And he did that several times, actually. For a number of years, he was very happy to go to the sportsman's show and talk about how he lived in the wild and in the wilderness. And he certainly was a visually interesting and appealing person. I like this headline, Hermit Takes to the Air. It's such a bad copy, and I can't find a better copy, but I think it's really quite good anyway. Despite his reputation as being a hermit, Noah did venture out of Cold River. Herb Helms, who is a legendary pilot in the Long Lake area, and started a float plane business that is now run by the third generation of the Helms family. Herb would come pick him up. He'd take him shopping to go get supplies. He'd help him visit friends. If people came to him, Noah would play the violin for them. And in 1948, the year after this rather delightful helicopter ride that looked that's kind of a fun little helicopter. I like that the bubble, so that the pilot can see below them. I would love to know what Noah thought of this helicopter ride. But he was so enraptured by flight that in 1948, he took a flying lesson right here in Lake Placid. The woman, and this is fun, the woman who gave him the lesson was this lady here on the right. Her name is Patricia Horan Rideout. And she actually ran a flying service and school at the Lake Placid Airport with her husband, Harold. She had been a member of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots Organization, also known as WASPs. And the WASPs had a really cool World War II record. They were not allowed to go into combat, but they were terrific pilots. They were trained well, they flew well. Their role was to transport aircraft from one place to another because they weren't allowed in combat. They also taught other pilots, including men. So women like Pat Rideout would teach men who were going into combat how to be fantastic aviators. And while she was in Lake Placid, Noah Rondo chose her to give him a flying lesson. I don't know if he took any more flying lessons, Maybe one was enough. Maybe he liked the excitement. Maybe he wanted to try it. I think one flying lesson is enough. You don't have to be a solo pilot or a licensed pilot to go and enjoy it at least once. Interestingly enough, as a WASP, Pat Rideout, who had trained at Avenger Field in Texas, which is where this photo was taken, she was also a pilot examiner. So she would also test other pilots to make sure that they knew what they were doing. So she had a really formidable job in addition to teaching hermits and school children and whoever might have taken lessons. For a long time, the WASPs were not well acknowledged by the US government. They were denied the Congressional Gold Medal. They were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal much later in life. Some of them had already passed away. Patricia was still apparently living when this happened. And they didn't even have veteran status for a long time. But it was finally awarded to them. And this woman taught right here in Lake Placid. Perhaps partially because so many people from the city vacationed in the Adirondacks, and Lake Placid in particular, in the first part of the 20th century, the New York Times featured regular reports of what was going on in town. It was very common, and it's fun to actually look in the archives of the New York Times to see what was going on in Lake Placid. When the Flying Circus came to town in 1930, it was listed in the Times, along with reports of summer sail races and the very first Lake Placid Horse Show, which took place the same summer as the Flying Circus. And the Times was especially excited to share when it was delivered by air. And it's kind of cute and charming, and it's quaint. And right now we're living in a time where there's a lot of bad news. And so to read a news article that was sort of quaint and simple, I think is kind of refreshing. The Times was just so excited by this event. And it says, it's really nicely written, actually. More than 1,500 copies of the New York Times, weighing slightly more than half a ton, were delivered at summer hotels here and at Lake Saranac shortly after 7 o'clock this morning, only a few hours after they came off the press in West. Then there's a typo there. Actually, in the New York Times, ironically enough, trucks, airplanes, and fast railroad trains expedited the delivery. Ordinarily, when planes are not used, the deliveries are not made before 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Taken from the presses after 1 a.m. in New York City, the newspapers were rushed to Grand Central Station. At Albany, they were placed on fast trucks, driven to Albany Airport, and were loaded on 2 Travel Air biplanes owned by Flyers Incorporated of Albany. One plane took off at 5:18 a.m., the other a minute later. Yesterday's delivery was somewhat hampered by the fog that caused the Flyers to seek emergency landings. But this morning they followed a different route. They swung out over Plattsburgh and came down the Saranac Valley, where the visibility was better. At 7:35 a.m., one of the planes glided down to a landing beside the Lake Placid Club, which you see in this postcard on the left. And a few minutes later, the guests, not long out of bed, were reading the news on the porches. The second plane came down at Saranac at 8:14 a.m. The combined speed of the train, trucks, and airplanes had brought the New York Times to the heart of the Adirondacks at about the same time that late-rising residents of New York City were getting their copies. And that's not the only time that we would hear from the New York Times about the plane, about papers being delivered to the Adirondacks by plane. It was really apparently an exciting thing. When I was a child, I used to wonder how the Times got up to Plattsburgh, where I grew up, so quickly. And come to find out that for many, many years, the Times has been really on top of things, of getting the paper to us as quickly as possible. Who in here lives in Lake Placid? Does everybody live in Lake Placid? Okay, a lot of Lake Placiders. People who don't live in Lake Placid, do you work in Lake Placid? Do you love Lake Placid? Yes, okay. There's something special about this place. You know, we live here, we work here. Some of us, like me, grew up spending time here. And as I said before, because I can't stress this enough, part of the fun of doing research for this book was exploring the stories of the people behind all of these flights. It's not interesting at all if it's just a list of planes. I like planes, they're cool, they're fun, but that would be the most boring book that I could possibly write. And you probably wouldn't want to read it either. But Lake Placid has managed to have more than a few interesting and even glamorous pilots attached to it. We saw Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh wasn't landing in Speculator. No offense to Speculator, I love that town. He wasn't going to Saranac Lake. I love Saranac Lake. I live there. He came to Lake Placid. You know, there's something about Lake Placid that has always drawn people here, and it's special. The young woman on the right in the flying ensemble is a very young aviatrix named Eleanor Smith, and she was an absolute star. At the age of 17, she flew underneath the 4 bridges on Manhattan's East River, underneath the bridges. She did this in 1928 because her friends dared her to do it. The city newspapers nicknamed her the Flying Flapper, and she was a very, very good pilot. Surviving flying under the bridges of the East River, I think, is no small feat. She actually began flying lessons at the age of 10. Orville Wright himself finalized her pilot's license, her pilot certification, when she was only 16, and she went on to set numerous altitude records. She was a very, very skilled pilot. And in September of 1928, she was right here in the Adirondacks, right here in Lake Placid. Her adventures were reported not just in the Lake Placid News, which I have so enjoyed reading in my research, but by the Times as well. This article is, once again, from the Times. I like how they say special to the New York Times, Lake Placid. While she was in Lake Placid, she scouted for potential landing field locations. She was in a car accident, only slightly injured, didn't affect her flying. And she introduced the Times pilots to a new type of parachute. And once again, here's the Times being absolutely, I would say, jaunty with their language. In a talk with the newspaper pilots, it was asserted that a little instruction in the use of the new model backpack parachutes would not be amiss. And the 2 pilots, who had spent several hours fighting their way through the fog to get the papers delivered on schedule, went a step further than verbal instruction. They went aloft with Miss Smith and Bert White of the Irving Company, and, donning the new chutes, made exhibition jumps for the summer visitors. Both pilots of the newspaper planes expressed satisfaction with the new chutes, saying that they were more comfortable and less bulky than the old-fashioned seat pack, which has been in use for several years. This is 1928. People had only been flying for 26 years. These nice people in the front row, or front in terms of people, they have been skydiving. I learned this evening. I don't want to go skydiving. I don't ever want to go skydiving. It sounds terrifying. If you do go skydiving, have a great time. I love that for you. Have fun. It's wonderful. I don't want to go. I don't want to go skydiving. I certainly don't want to go skydiving with these early model parachutes that sound really terrifying. But here in Lake Placid, in 1928, you have this rock star young lady aviatrix. You have pilots delivering the newspaper, trying to fight through fog so that we can read the New York Times on our porches. And it's kind of like a little pilot party. Everyone's excited to be together, and it's so fun and so novel that they're putting it in the newspaper. There is an interesting story here, but I really just wanted to leave you with one more very cool photo of Lake Placid. I talked earlier about how exciting it was for people to get this new perspective on the Earth and seeing it in a very new, novel way. And business people were very quick to capitalize on that. I mentioned Dwight Church, who sold photographs of farms to the farmers who owned them. I think that was pretty clever. This ad for the Stevens House does a fantastic job of showing off the hotel in a way that a ground level image really could not. For a few decades, Stevens House was one of the premier hotels in the Adirondacks as a whole, much less Lake Placid, drawing guests for luxurious summer relaxation and access to the nearby high peaks. This was at a time when if people went on vacation, they went for the whole summer. They made Lake Placid part of their lives in a pretty significant way. So for the Stevens House people, this was very clever advertising. You can also see Stevens House in the photo on the left. Like many photos that I have seen in doing my research at various libraries, at historical societies, we don't know who the photographers were. Sometimes we do, most of the time we don't. Somebody was out flying around and took a great photo, and now we get to, someone managed to keep it, much like Karen keeping the photo of an incident her father was involved in 1955. The photos persist, and we have these wonderful memories. And I do have a tendency to say, I love this photo. I know, I'm sorry, I said it several times this evening, but I give presentations and I talk about the book, and it's as if every single photo is a favorite of mine. I really love them all. And I think it's because, once again, they tell such interesting stories. This is a version of Lake Placid that we don't have anymore. Stevens House is long gone. The airport where Lindbergh landed is much different now. The aerial views that we see when we fly here are different. But we get to enjoy them and experience a bit of that old Lake Placid through these images and these stories. And I am really very, very pleased and grateful that I was able to share a few of them with you tonight. So, thank you. It's 8 o'clock on the dot. How'd I do? So yeah, I'm happy to take any photos whatsoever. Peter will bring the microphone to you, or if you have a story you want to share, or anything. If you met Noah Rondo on a helicopter, that would be even more interesting. Peter.
Yo.
So this is not exactly the Adirondacks, but close. My aunt and uncle met. She and he were both crazy about flying, and she was still was 4'10", and so they put. So this, and the year would be, I'm trying to figure out the year. It was probably like 1938 or something like that, and a little before the war. And so anyway, they put this block on the pedal so she could fly.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And that's Ithaca. That was in Ithaca.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
When I was a child, one of my favorite movies was The Muppets Take Manhattan. And there's a scene where the rats are they're cooking in the kitchen at the diner, and they have things tied to their feet, like butter. They have butter tied to their feet. So I'm kind of picturing that, something like almost somebody on stilts with blocks tied not so much to the pedals, but to her feet, which I think that's so interesting. I personally am not that tall. Obviously, I have to sit on a cushion when I fly, because I need to be able to see up and over. Thank you for sharing that. That's really cool.
What kind of plane do you fly?
Okay, that was really fun. I have taken lessons in a Piper Cherokee 160 and also a 180. They are small planes. I think small planes are amazing. They can seem very intimidating. They can seem very scary, but there is something very magical also about flying a plane like that. The Cherokee seats about 4 people. It's not a big plane. You can certainly get very familiar with your co-pilot, and hopefully you enjoy that person's company. And it's scary, but it's also really exciting. Is anybody here a pilot? I always like to ask. All righty. I recognize those guys back there. You're in. Oh, okay.
Another question? Go ahead. My son flies the 767 for FedEx, but he began flying here in Lake Placid with Terry Politi.
Awesome. That's cool. That's the sort of, I love that sort of story. I think that's so interesting. And how did he get interested in flying, if I may ask?
I guess from me.
Oh. Are you a pilot?
Yes.
See now I get to turn the tables. And what do you fly?
I don't anymore.
Okay. It's an exciting thing.
Hi, I've been flying out of the Adirondacks for 50 years. I might be able to add some history to your. I've taken some notes here, and I got a lot of stuff I could add to your if you want some more information on
I'd love
things in the Adirondacks and stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have had so much fun giving talks and learning from people. There may have to be another book because I am continuing to learn interesting things. So yeah, I would absolutely love that.
People don't realize how many aviation companies that are in New York State over the years. It's really Curtiss Wright was one of them, but I can tell you a bunch of stuff later on.
Yeah.
when you have some time.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the fun things about Curtiss Wright is that for a time in World War I, there was you probably know this, but maybe it's new to everyone else. In Saranac Lake, there was a company called the Palmer Simpson Company. It was 2 tuberculosis patients who started this business making the floats for exceptionally large hydroplanes for the United States Navy. And the fuselages and the majority of the planes were made by Curtiss. And so it was sort of a joint effort. They hired boat builders, which I thought was really interesting because boat builders would have a good sense of keeping something afloat. And so that was a brief period of time when that business was in Saranac Lake. And then the Navy had all that they needed and they closed up shop. There's a picture in the book of the workshops at the Curtiss factory of them making something similar.
Yep.
Clearly we have a lot to talk about.
I'm fascinated by the ski plane. Do you have any story about that?
Yeah, so this particular plane, it was Colonial Airlines, which for a time was the air carrier out of Lake Clear that took passenger flights. They heavily promoted taking past people coming from downstate, people coming from New Jersey to come up and ski in the Adirondacks, specifically in the Saranac Lake area, and also in the Montreal area. Coincidentally, though, so not only were people using planes as a way to gather ski tourists, but there are actually planes that land on skis as well. And that has been part of Adirondack history as well. Particularly we have some very long cold winters, and that proved to be a very useful tool for a lot of people to keep their businesses going. Early on, another great marketing tool was hotels would start offering scenic flights. They would hire a local pilot, and in the wintertime, those planes would have skis on them, and they might go from Lake Placid to Saranac Lake and back for the hotel guests. It was also very common in the central Adirondacks where there's so many lakes, Long Lake and Racket Lake, Old Forge. Those are have long been popular places for float planes. And so also in winter, certainly a lot of ski planes. There was a ski plane that once went through the ice in Lake Flower. No one was injured, but was it you? Yes. Did you really? Do you want to tell us about the story? This is amazing.
We were up flying one day on skis, and Terry Politi, me, and another airplane. Terry had a camp over on lower Saranac Lake, and he was going to land at the camp. I was circling overhead watching him land on the lake, and when he landed, there was a dog that came out and almost hit the airplane, and I'm watching this from above. So I was thinking that same dog was going to come running out when I touched down, and sure enough, it did. And I tried to avoid it, and I made a right turn, went out into the lake, and hit a little stump. Lake Flowers got a lot of stumps, and I hit a stump, and it went down, and the ski broke through the ice, and the wing came down on the ice, and we took a boat out and lifted the wing up and got a board underneath it and got it back to shore. And it was sitting at his camp for about a month until I could find a new ski for it so I could fly it out. And the worst part about that was the ice was starting to get thin, and I took off, and I had to borrow a prop and a ski from a friend of mine. I was taking off, and in Saranac Lake, there's a channel there, and I had about 800 feet to get in the air, and when I took off, I broke ground. The airplane was getting light, and I was actually water skiing over the water because I ran out of ice, and I had enough airspeed to keep the airplane going, but that was a pretty scary moment.
It sounds like it. It sounds like I'm delighted to tell you you are not the first person to have gone through the ice on Lake Flower in a plane on skis. There's a great article in one of the old newspapers that I think it was in, actually the Malone paper reported it pretty well, of in the 1930s. Something similar happened.
Oh, I was a little ahead of my time.
Yeah. I kind of had a feeling, yeah. So you were not the first. You're presumably one in a line of a few intrepid pilots who have had some adventures with skis. Peter, do you want to share your story about the ski plane?
Yes, I was telling her earlier, my family has a camp on Connery Pond, which was pictured in one of your things, and once I skied in the winter, and there was what looked like a plane at the far end of the pond, and all of a sudden the engine started, and I was skiing across the pond, and it took off and flew right over my head. Well, it was Jim Catalano from Wilmington. He has an airfield right by Hazelton Lumber. And the Bergaminis, who have the camp next to ours on Connery Pond, they were out of town, and they needed somebody to check their house. And so rather than drive up from Wilmington, Jim flew his ski plane up. And much to my surprise, flew right over my head on that dinky little pond in the middle of the winter. So that was my story. And when you showed that picture and you were talking about it, and we talked about that earlier, you know Jim, he still maintains that airfield in Wilmington.
Yeah, it's fun to. I'd have to email Jim and ask him if he remembers flying over a skier on Connery Pond, because I'd like to get his perspective on maybe how close he thought he was to you, because I would imagine for both of you that would be a little nerve-wracking experience. Mm-hmm. We have another question.
Yeah.
I was just interested when you said that early on people could ride just for pennies a time. Was it very inexpensive? I would have thought it would have been very expensive, but apparently not.
They were very short flights, and it was probably not affordable for everyone, certainly, but I was very surprised to learn how inexpensive some short flights at flying circuses were, and they were quick, up and down and up and down, and you're up and you're back down already. But really, an astonishing number of people, even throughout the country, who had their first flight that way, and really got this amazing sensation, like a carnival ride. Which it does seem astonishing. Flying nowadays is a very expensive hobby, even to take a lesson or to own a plane. It is very expensive. As I'm sure the pilots in the room know. But I was really kind of touched to realize that people could get such affordable flights and have that opportunity. It's so accessible to so many people. It'd be nice if we could do that way again, certainly. Anybody else? No? Well, thank you so much for, we have to do the raffle.
Well, let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris.